Hello and welcome back to You Are My Boro with myself, Dom Sean Scott Wilson, both of the Northern Echo, and you'll be delighted to know that we've got some football to talk about, so we won't be chuntering on about service station stops in this vid. Although, I don't know whether you'd seen, Scott, but I was delighted in the comments from the video earlier this week that I'd got a fair bit of support for my Leeds service station moans.
Yes, it's obviously a major issue, isn't it? It's obviously a major issue. And again, without wanting to go completely down the rabbit hole, we have a bit of clearly we have a work WhatsApp kind of chat. And I dropped in this week. This is where it's worrying now about modern technology, because all of a sudden, you know, when you're on like Facebook or something on your phone and it recommends things for you. Ideal Christmas present: English motorway service station top trumps. Now, in here, it's clearly somebody's been listening to what we've been talking about here. But B, if that doesn't get the party started, tea time, Christmas Day around the table, then I don't know. Motorway service station top trumps. I mean, what a winner!
55 of the nation's favourite stations.
Wow.
The hottest thing in motoring since heated seats, says Jeremy Clarkson, quoted on the front of the box. Charnock, Richard, Watford Gap, and Cobham are the three pictured on the front.
And the three that they pull out.
We're not going to talk about
Cobham is massive.
Don't know that I've been in Cobham.
Yeah, M25, isn't it? You only really hit it if you're going maybe like Brighton. It's proper South Coast territory, Cobham, because you're right round the M25. Southampton away, Bournemouth away, Brighton away. That's Cobham.
So there's our Works Christmas Do sorted. Anyway, we'll have a good game of that over a few pints in Boro one night. Anyway, football. Bristol City on Saturday afternoon. Let us know where you're stopping off if you're a fan and you're making the trip or you're making the trip back. Scott was over at Rockcliffe on Thursday having a chat with Michael Carrick, so we'll obviously discuss that. And we will look back at Kieran Scott's interview with Mark Drury on BBC Tees earlier this week, which was insightful and revealing. First things first, then, Scott, the press conference. I'm sure by now you've read the news lines to come from it, but just a quick overview of what came out of that on Thursday afternoon.
Yeah, a few interesting bits and bobs. Obviously, a couple of weeks since we've seen Michael Carrick, so the obvious thing, I guess, first was a catch-up on the injuries. We all knew, obviously, Lenihan out for the season and Carrick kind of, as you'd expect, just underlining, you know, the fact that is a big blow. You know, as he said with all the injured players, you know, he still wants senior injured players in and around the kind of first team squad at the training ground. He said that with Smith. He said it again with Lenihan. And then obviously the Lenihan talk kind of lended itself to January, which I'll get to in a second. But then the other two are obviously McGree and Force. Still no real definitive on when those players will be back. Definitely not back for this weekend. Probably not back for next weekend. But that then led to the kind of follow-up. Well, look, are we talking Darragh Lenihan style here? You know, could this be out for the season territory? And in fairness to Carrick, he was very clear there. No, absolutely not. We're talking weeks. You know, I can't really pin down exactly how many, but we're talking weeks. We're not talking that length of injury. So I think from that, we can probably say before the end of the year, but maybe more into December than the next couple of weeks. So, you know, but at least it's a semi-positive in that those are starting to loom back on the horizon. Then, as I say, bit of a chat on January. You know, does being without Lenihan and Smith change what you want to do in January? And again, Carrick, you know, didn't really say yes, but certainly didn't say no, which I think sometimes with all managers, but probably with Carrick in particular, is something to read into. I mean, I think Boro will now look to sign a centre-half in January, even if it's just a short-term second half of the season loan deal for cover, because, you know, it's the fact that really Vandenberg would be the logical cover for Fry McNair at centre-half. But with Tommy Smith out and Anthony Dyke still, you know, clearly not at the top of kind of Carrick's thoughts, then Vandenberg's Boro's first choice right back at the minute. So they are short of cover there. So I think we'll see that. And then we asked the question that we talked about earlier in terms of the goalkeepers. And I thought, Carrick was quite interested in that. He said, look, we know that Dieng and Glover are probably going to get called up in January. That's not something that's coming out the blue. It's very much been on our radar. There's lots of different options. Clearly promoting Jones to starting spot is one. Going out and signing another goalkeeper is two. But he did pretty much, say, look, all three of the keepers have callback options in their loans. That's standard practice now. Pretty much every loan that every club does has a January callback option. So yeah, that's something we'll consider. He then went on to say, look, it's got to be right for the individual. Clearly, what he doesn't want to do is bring keepers back from what have been successful loans where they're getting a lot of game time to then sit them on the bench for the rest of the second half of the season. That doesn't really do anyone any good. So it's got to be something Boro are going to think about. But I think, Roberts, Bryn, Hemming, it's on the table that any one of those could come back to fill the gap that's going to be created by Dieng and Glover heading off.
And when you talk about the possible goalkeeper scenarios there, you would think, wouldn't you, that signing a keeper permanently in January would be the least likely, given that you've got three out on loan, given you've got two, an established number one and an international deputy, which we talked about in the Vaden pod earlier this week, and you've got Jamie Jones there as the third choice. That would be unlikely, wouldn't it, signing one on a permanent deal?
Yeah, I think especially for the fact that, the two keepers are only going to be away for a month. And I say that knowing that it's going to be an important month, plenty of football to be played. But the reality is that by the back end of February, you would imagine that Dieng is back to being Boro's number one and Glover is being back to being Boro's number two. So with Jamie Jones in the squad as well, it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever to bring in, a permanent keeper or even a loan keeper of the whole of the second half of the season, really. I think one of the keepers will come back, and then the decision will be who out of him and Jones is the number one and who is the number two for the month when Dieng and Glover are away. And I think that's where we're probably going to end up at.
And on the defender front, so Kieran Scott on BBC Tees earlier this week, which we will talk about, the term he used was I think Lenahan's injury will perhaps focused minds ahead of January. Now, there's every chance that was an area that Boro might well have looked to strengthen anyway, but it now looks, as you touched on there, it now looks as an area which probably needs strengthening in January, doesn't it? Both at centre half and right back, really, because as you said, you've got Vandenberg covering at right back, clearly ahead of Anthony Dijksteel, who for whatever reason, since Carrick came in, has been unable to establish himself as the number one. And now, as things stand, the only centre half, if Vandenberg is playing at right back, the only centre half cover option is Matt Clark, who clearly hasn't played for more than a year. I think the other interesting thing is Paddy McNair, because we've touched on this, haven't we, over the last few weeks. McNair's out of contract at the end of the season. Now, there's been no shortage of reported interest in McNair over the course of the last probably year, 18 months or so. And a couple of months ago, when McNair wasn't in the team, you'd have looked at it and thought, if a bid comes in, then that probably makes Boro's minds up for them in January. And yet he's now a key player of the team. Now, he's still clearly one of the higher earners, but he's a key player in the team. And it maybe just makes that decision a little bit more difficult, does it?
Yeah, it's an interesting one with McNair, isn't it? Because I still think that it's unlikely that Middlesbrough will either want to or be in a financial position to offer Paddy McNair a new long-term deal on the money that he's on now, which, is there or thereabouts for being the club's highest earner just by dint of the wages that they were paying out at the time when he signed that deal. So, what do you do then? Well, do you just let it run to the end of the season and see what happens then and see where you're at then and what league you're in and maybe offer McNair a contract offer on, slightly lower terms and see if he accepts it or not? That's a possibility. But if there is money to be made, if Boro were to receive an offer from McNair in January, then clearly with Lenihan out, you're much, much more reluctant to do that business. But then again, if it's financial business that makes sense, then maybe you still decide, well, do you know what? We've got options. We've got players who we've earmarked as potential Paddy McNair replacements. Maybe we just have to move on that more forcefully than we thought we were going to have to.
Can we bring it forward
I don't think it's out of the question. Yeah, I don't think it's out of the question that a deal is potentially done. There's a lot of ifs in this. If a club comes in and puts money on the table for McNair, but I think Boro will be much more reluctant to do it now, because if McNair goes, you've really got to get two, haven't you? You've got to sign two players in January. All right, one of them can maybe be a loan just to cover you to the end of the season, but you're making your own life a lot more difficult. So, at the very, very least, I think Boro now will be an awfully lot more reluctant to get rid of McNair in January. I think in the ideal scenario now is probably that you let the contract run down until the summer, and then you reassess, make a contract offer if that's what you feel. But if you lose him then okay, you've lost him then. But he's done what you needed him to do this season. And who knows, we could be talking about Boro as a Premier League club come the end of the season, and then it's a completely different conversation for loads of different players. You know what I mean?
Just one final one on Carrick's press conference yesterday. You touched at the start on how those injured players, the experienced injured players, have still got a role to play around the place day to day. Is that something Carrick talked about then? Because I remember last season and early this season, Tony Mowbray up at Sunderland again and again talked about how even though club captain Corey Evans has been out all year, day to day he's still an integral figure around the place. He said the same about Ross Stewart in the second half of last season. Is that the case at Boro as well?
It is, yeah. Carrick did say it with Tommy Smith when he got injured, and he was probably even more forceful saying it with Lenihan. The fact is, you've got two of the biggest kind of voices and certainly the most experience in the dressing room out there. So yes, I know you've got Johnny House and you've got Matt Crooks. You've got experienced players, you've got big voices, but I think Lenihan and Smith will still have roles to play, even if it's just as a kind of shoulder for some of the players to lean on, whether it's guiding the younger players through. I think they will. Carrick will still want them involved. You're right on that in Mowbray. Some managers who I've spoken to in the past are very much of the attitude, no, I don't want them around. If they're not available, if they're not able to contribute on the pitch or in training, then really I don't want them around. They're a distraction. They're not what I want. Carrick's very much not like that. He puts a lot of faith, responsibility, whatever you want to call it, on his players. He's very much a manager who wants to self-police and dressing room. He likes the fact that the more experienced figures within this Boro squad have a say. They run the dressing room, if you like. He's very much of that mindset. And so I definitely think he's being sincere when he says that he wants Lenihan and Smith to still be a big part in that. Now, there's a limit to what they can do, isn't there? And certainly initially Lenihan won't be in and around the place because he's not at that stage of his rehab. But I think certainly once you get 2-3 months into his rehab and he is starting to do gym work and things like that, then I think he will still have a role within the kind of leadership group within the dressing room.
Moving back then from Thursday and Michael Carrick's press conference to Tuesday and Kieran Scott in that hour-long interview with Mark Drury on BBC Tees. In terms of kind of what we learned from that and what came out of it, I think the standout lines were talking about January, the defensive decision to be made, as I touched upon. Also talking about centre forwards and the fact that, yes, they're likely to be in the market for a striker, but priority number one will be ensuring they don't stand in the way of Josh Coburn and halt the progress of Josh Coburn, which I thought was brilliant to hear, and secondly makes complete sense given that he's your homegrown talent and he's currently your first choice striker. And then there's the Sam Greenwood stuff as well. Why haven't Boro made the deal permanent yet? Kieran Scott explained, as I'm sure you've read or listened or heard, by now. Well, it's not as simple as that. Clubs to clubs have agreed, but the only complicating factor, Scott said, was if Leeds win promotion to the Premier League this season, and then Greenwood would be in line to receive a significant wage increase, which obviously then complicates matters. Yeah. If Boro don't win promotion, if Boro go work with Leeds, then you would think that changes matters, because Boro would be in a position where they could pay more. But I thought that was quite revealing and insightful as well. And clearly that's a message that is useful for Boro to get out there, because if it wasn't, then the question would be asked again and again and again over the course of the season, wouldn't it? Why haven't Boro activated this clause yet?
Well, I know we're bound to say this as kind of journalists and people who make a living out of, being in the press, but I think it shows the benefit of clubs actually being open about this type of thing. And, it gets hidden so much. And in the past, Boro, time and time again, it's just been so difficult to get a really firm handle on contracts or deals or payments or anything like that, when actually I think an awful lot of the time, if the club is able to be honest and open like Kieran Scott was with Mark Drury in the week, then I think it helps everyone, because it, like you say, it just removes that uncertainty and that constant questioning where Michael Carrick would have been put on the spot constantly in press conferences. Do you want to sign Sam Greenwood? Why hasn't the deal been done? Is there a problem with Leeds? Is there a problem with Greenwood? Well, now we know, don't we? We know what the situation is. Boro want to get the deal done. Leeds have agreed the terms of the deal. And I don't think it reflects badly in any way, shape or form on Sam Greenwood that he wants to...
Makes complete sense, doesn't it? It's only natural.
It seems like he wants to wait and see what happens for the rest of the season, see where Leeds are at, see where Boro are at, and then he can talk wages and whatever and do it. I mean, that's not an unreasonable position for Sam Greenwood to take. I think any Boro fans who kind of throw that back at him and say, well, he should be crawling over hot stones to play for Boro, blah, blah, blah. Look, that's fine. But the reality is he's a young footballer making a way in this game. He's having a reasonably good season. Yes, Boro have done well by taking him, etc. But, he has got himself to look out for as well. And if there is the chance of a big pay rise, if there is the chance of playing for Leeds in the Premier League, then he's got to think about that. That's not to say that in the end he might not still sign for Boro or whatever anyway, but it's just nice to know what the situation is, I think, isn't it? And so I thought it was, commendable how kind of honest to know. And in fairness, we've had chats with Kieran Scott, both on and off the record in the past, haven't we? And, he is open. He is, that's him really. He is kind of wanting to get stuff out there and wanting to be transparent. And I think that's really, really welcome. And I think it kind of, all melds into the fact that it's a lot more harmonious there now. So, you can clearly see that there's been massive progress in the last 12, 18 months in terms of just developing the scouting and recruitment team, getting them aligned with the coach and team and Michael Carrick and what the team wants, and actually putting into practice a lot of the stuff that's been talked about in the past, but just has never happened. And, we don't need to rake kind of old ground with Warnock and Wilder and all the clashes over recruitment and everything there's been. But, it just feels completely different now. And I think the fact that Boro, Scott in particular, but the kind of Boro hierarchy in general are willing to be much more open and transparent and let the fans know exactly what's going on. That all kind of melds into that, doesn't it?
Yeah, I was going to touch on that, what you talked about there in terms of how everyone's pulling in the same direction. I thought it was interesting and revealing when Scott talked about how now Kieran Scott, Chris Jones, the chief scout, and the rest of those in the scouting team feel like they've got a real grasp on what Michael Carrick wants and wants from a player, likes in a player, and sees in a player. And he talked about the Rav van den Berg example and how they identified Van den Berg as a target. And when they sat down with Jonathan Woodgate and showed him the clips, Woodgate immediately talked about how he loved what the scouting team thought he'd love about Van den Berg. And that makes the whole process so much easier, doesn't it? If you're not having to sieve through however many players who are, clearly, he's nothing of the sort of what I'm looking for type thing. If you're immediately providing a list who 99% of those are going to be right up Michael Carrick or whoever's in charge street, then I think that clearly you're onto a successful path. And I think the other thing on that is what Boro clearly want to get what we're clearly working towards is, if and when Carrick does eventually move on, his replacement will be someone who fits the mould of the type of player Boro has, the type of football Boro want to play, rather than them bringing someone in and having to suddenly readjust and start again with a recruitment and realign to the type of player the new manager wants. So
it's interesting.
Yeah,
I was just going to say exactly the same thing. Yeah, I was just going to say exactly the same thing. And in some ways, that will be the acid test of all of this, because it's all very well for Kieran Scott and the rest of the Boro kind of recruitment operation to say, well, everything's fantastic now. We're in massive harmony with Carrick, Woodgate, everything. We've turned the corner. This is us for the rest of, this is us now. This is the way we do things. That's great. But you're right. It only works if and when Michael Carrick leaves, that they bring someone in, a head coach, a coaching team that can fit into that model and work with it. And it's a pretty seamless transition, because the whole thing falls down again if you do what Boro have done countless times in the past and jerk from one type of manager to the next to a different type of manager, completely different playing style, totally different ideas about recruitment. There's been an awful lot of time and effort put into development in this now, and a fair bit of kind of heartache and emotion along the way and fallouts and goodness knows what. So what you really hope is that when that time comes, all of this stands that test, because it would be bitterly disappointing if we're talking about all this, but actually when Carrick leaves, the whole thing is turned completely upside down, because for whatever reason, Boro decide to go in a wildly different direction, which, as I say, we have seen a lot of times in the past. So we'll see what happens when that comes to it. You'd like to think that lessons are being learned and this is the way that Boro are going to go, and whatever happens in the past will meld into this, but we'll see, won't we?
Yeah, because I think looking back on that theme, looking back to when Woodgate took charge, and this is no one's fault, really. It was just naturally the way things fell. But Woodgate clearly had a vision of the way he wanted his Boro team to play. But he said quite openly, didn't he? He perhaps didn't anticipate just how difficult it would be to get a team that had been moulded to play a Tony Pulis style of football to transform from that into kind of this, free-flowing football team that play football a completely different way. It happens, but that takes time, doesn't it, to develop? And unfortunately for Woodgate, obviously results.
It's interesting because you bring up Woodgate there, and it's difficult because Boro might have gone down had Woodgate staying in charge. We don't know, do we? They might have done. So in some respects, making that change, bringing in Warnock, it might have been absolutely essential. So maybe Boro did the absolute right thing there. But to a certain extent, that was I'm not going to say panic's the wrong word, but that was a response to the fact that actually this model that we're trying to bring in with Jonathan Woodgate, for whatever reason, just isn't working. And we're going to have to completely turn it upside down if we're going to keep Boro in the league. Now, Boro could have done that at the start of this season, couldn't they? They could have panicked. Now, it was still pretty early, in fairness, when Carrick began to turn things around. What would Boro be doing now if, instead of this run that they'd been on in the last month and a half, they'd lost half the games that they've actually won, and they were still down 17th, 18th, and Michael Carrick was still saying, I believe in what we're trying to do. I think we can do it. Would they have been patient up to this point, or would there have been a response? That, we don't know, do we? Thankfully, we never had to find out. But, it's going to be interesting to see when there are more sticky periods. How long do you stick with this? Because I think it's important now that they do. I really do. I think they have to give this model, this overarching way that they're going to do things, a proper chance. And I think they will. I really do think they will. And to be fair, I never say never, but I don't see Michael Carrick getting Boro into a Woodgate-esque situation where there is a very real danger of some seriously bad things happening in terms of where the team end up. So hopefully they won't have to make that decision. But Scott alluded to that again, didn't he, on Tuesday, where he said, what would it have said for us, if after 5, 6, 7 games we'd said, you know what, this isn't working, let's give up on it. And I think he's absolutely right there. But things turned round before they probably really had a decision to make, didn't they?
Yeah, and Scott said, didn't he, that there was never any thought about Michael Carrick losing his job. That was never, ever, ever in consideration. And I think what's interesting, both in terms of conversations on and off the record, that those behind the scenes shared Michael Carrick's belief that there was more than enough promise in the performances in the early weeks of the season. I know we've talked about how we perhaps didn't see it, and we didn't see the transformation coming, but Carrick wasn't the only one who saw encouragement in the displays, despite the fact Boro weren't getting results in the early weeks of the season. But thankfully, those results have picked up. If you haven't, I'm sure you have, but if you haven't listened back to that interview with Mark on Tees, then that's on BBC Sounds, and you can listen back to it in full. I highly recommend it at any point. Bristol City on Saturday. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. That's an interesting one, isn't it? I think there's only one place between the two sides, isn't there? So, that Bristol City, obviously, Liam Manning in charge there now. There has been a definite upturn since he went in. Interestingly, Michael Carrick confirmed, or at least he was asked about it on Thursday, and they were actually on a kind of pro license course together, spent a reasonable amount of time together doing kind of coaching badges together and bouncing ideas off of each other a little bit in that kind of time. And, from what you read and hear about Manning, he's certainly more of a Carrick style manager than a Nigel Pearson style manager. I think he'll want to get Bristol City playing much more like the kind of football that Carrick has Boro playing. So I think it's an interesting game. I see no reason why Boro can't go down there and get a result. I really don't. I mean, yes, McGree's still missing. Yes, Force is still missing. But, as we saw from the Leicester win before, but to be fair, from the vast majority of Boro's performances in the last month and a half, it's not an insurmountable obstacle being without those two players. There's still plenty of quality in the Boro lineup. I don't think we'll see many changes, if any, from the side that was kind of playing most of the games prior to the international break. We've got the team running along the bottom there. I suspect it'll be somewhere pretty close to that. And I think, I think refreshed and re-energized after the international break, I'd back Boro to go down there and get a result, wouldn't you?
I would, yeah. I fancy Boro to win on Saturday, and I think this spell of games is clearly going to tell us a lot about Boro, isn't it? Because after Bristol City, you've then got Preston, Leeds, and Ipswich, and hellfire. That's a testing 3 games, isn't it? But as we've talked about at length, really, over the last few weeks, it's against the top teams or the better teams in the league that we've seen the better showings from Boro so far this season. Boro will certainly have nothing to fear. Certainly won't fear anything going into those games, will they? No,
absolutely, and nor should they after having beat Leicester in the game before the international break. I mean, the Plymouth game aside, this feels like a much more solid Boro side now, doesn't it? It feels like a side who are going to go into those matches against the division's leading teams and, match them stride for stride, really. And that, that was certainly the case in the Leicester game. I don't see any reason why it should be any different in the Preston, Leeds and Ipswich games that you've kind of mentioned there. Now, Bristol City away probably doesn't fall into the real top side category, but any away game in the Championship, cliche alert, is a challenge. As I say, against a side who have been in pretty good shape themselves prior to the break, even more so. So, Boro are going to have to go down there and kind of get the basics right, and be hard to break down, which I think they will be. But then, again, as we've seen in a lot of the recent games, if they can do that, then they've definitely got the quality at the other end of the pitch to win games. And they've also, as we've alluded to in previous vids, got 3 or 4 players on the bench who can potentially come in the last 20 minutes, half an hour of games and be genuine game changers, which, has got to be a valuable asset, hasn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, if you're making the trip to Bristol this weekend, safe travels, enjoy your service station stops. We'll be back next week to reflect on that game and to look ahead to that testing spell to come, as we discussed there. Do subscribe if you're watching on YouTube and you haven't already, and give us a like and follow on your podcast platforms as well if you prefer to listen to us that way. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening this week. Enjoy your weekend. Safe travels, as I say, if you're going down to Bristol City. Here's hoping you head back with 3 points. Thanks very much.